Hello Blender heads, in this tutorial we're gonna create this animation. Blender 3.6, which is currently in alpha, will officially include the simulation nodes for geometry nodes. I've already made a bunch of videos here on my channel about simulation nodes back when it was still experimental, but now we know in Blender 3.6 it will be official. The fine people at the Blender Foundation also released a demo file which looks like this. And when I saw that, I thought I have to recreate this on my own and figure out how it works. So in this video we're gonna do it once again. Start from scratch and figure out what we actually have to calculate and why. As always, the finished blend file of this free tutorial can be downloaded from Patreon. Here I am in Blender 3.6 Alpha. This is an alpha version, which means it can be buggy, but it's already working really well. And this is the version that you want because that's the one that includes the simulation nodes. First of all, we're going to need a collider. So let's just Shift A, mesh, take an icosphere, crank up the resolution a little bit, and that's it. And we're going to use the cube and go over to geometry nodes and click on new to get a new node tree. And the first thing we want is this a circle. All right, so Shift A, mesh, primitive, mesh circle. Cool, we're gonna use that instead of the cube. And it gives us a circle. Where's the icosphere? Let's scale that down a little. Okay, we're gonna fill it. Doesn't matter, we can use triangles. We want a radius of 1, that is perfect. And then we will scatter some points onto that circle. Shift A, point, distribute points on faces. All right, if we look at it from the top. Now density, we crank that up to something that looks cool. And then we have our group output, and that's gonna be all the way over there. We're not gonna really need the group input for now. Maybe we plug in some custom attributes then later. And I'm gonna pin this view so it doesn't go away if I click over to the icosphere. Okay, now how can we make the particles, let's call them particles, our little points here, be repelled by our collider, the icosphere? Auto smooth also makes it look nicer. Well, we have to think about calculating if we have a collision. So what is a collision? Well, if our particle is inside of our sphere, right? It's pretty easy, actually. So we need to get in the sphere. We can just drag that in. We switches over to relative. And then we get the location, which is the center point of the sphere. And we also get the scale, which if we scale this up and down, also comes in very handy. Which one of these particles is actually inside of the sphere? Let's say we look at this particle here. And then we have the center point of our sphere here. We can calculate a vector between these 2 points. And if that vector is shorter than the radius of our icosphere, then that particle is inside of the icosphere. Pretty easy. So let's just look for it, a vector math node. We need to subtract 2 vectors. Which one? Well, we need to get the position of our point. So position. And this is going to be the position of this point coming in from our geometry when we plug this in back here. And then the difference to the location of the sphere gives us this vector here. Okay, now if that length of that vector, so maybe we just duplicate this, set it to length. If that is, so we need a compare node. If that value is less than, so if it's shorter than the radius, which is the scale of our icosphere, because we made that icosphere and by default it has a scale of 1, which is a radius of 1. And then when we scale it, this factor here is what we get out here. And then the position is the location when we set it to relative. So we get this. And if that length now is less than the radius, which is the scale, then we know that it's inside. So we have to do something with this particle, right? These particles out here that will not be less than the radius. So we're not even touching these, but we have to do something with these. What do we have to do? Well, we have to set position. We have to set the position of the particle, the particles that are inside. And where do we want to set them? Well, first we want to set them to the outside. So just out here. Move all of these particles inside, out. And in what direction? Well, that direction. So we already know that this is the distance or the direction vector of this particle compared to the center of our sphere. So we want to put this particle out here. How do we get that? Well, we take our subtracted vector, which is this guy. Then we just duplicate this. We normalize this vector to a length of 1. Where is it? Here. So now we have a vector of length 1, which is probably really long. And then we scale that vector. Scale, where is it? Here. Scale the vector to the radius of our sphere. So now we have a vector, let me just delete all of this, a vector in the correct direction at the length of the radius of the sphere. And this is where we want to place our particle. So just plug it in, position. All right, is it working? It's doing something, but it's placing them down here. So we just have to add the dislocation vector to that. How do we do that? Just plug it in here. Add our original location, and now, yep, it's working. Okay, so basically we already have the first part done. Our icosphere, and even if we scale it or move it, is now repelling the particles. Cool. This is our first node setup, which is responsible for moving or for colliding the particles with our collision object, the icosphere. You'll notice that we're working with circles and spheres here, and there's a reason for that, because it's the simplest way to calculate collisions, basically. So, but of course, if I bring up a timeline and I hit spacebar to play, nothing's happening. I can move this around and it's working, but there is no simulation happening yet. And this is where the simulation nodes come in. So let's go Shift A, simulation zone. And I already explained this in the other videos. Now, if you've never done any simulation in Geometry Nodes before, you should probably watch my older videos. They're all still valid and working. So we plug in our geometry here. And then whatever comes out here on the next frame, right? We have frames in our simulation or animation, is the input of this node. So we put our simulation in between here in this area. And then the output here is just the output of our group. Cool. So of course we want this set position node, which is the entire simulation that we have now, or the calculation, to be inside of our animation. Now, if I hit spacebar now, still nothing happening. Why? Well, because we're just setting a fixed position. We're not working with that position or with that animation. We have to do something to the particles on each rendered frame. And that's what we're going to do next. First of all, though, let me put this with, just select the whole thing, Ctrl-G, put it in a node group. So now you can see all of this, which is the collision with the collider object in its own node group. So out here we have that, and that's very slick node setup. We can even name it, so we call it collider. This is the calculation for the collider. Right, now animation. Let's think about this real quick. First, we actually already moved a particle from its original position to a new position out here in that direction. And this direction is our velocity vector. So the particle already now, just because of our calculation, has a velocity that we can use to animate that particle flying in that direction. But how do we calculate this in our simulation? We kind of need the old position, and then we get a new position coming out of here. And that's our velocity that we use. Pipe back into the simulation for the next frame to do something with that velocity. First, however, we need to get the old position. And we do that in the simulation nodes setup by capturing an attribute. So capture attribute on this geometry, the input geometry. And we want to capture a vector on each point. Yeah, because we're working with a point cloud here. And what are we capturing? The position. So now we have an attribute here, which is the position of the particle on the previous frame. And here we're changing the position. This is our current frame position. So back here, before we actually get to our simulation output, we're gonna get the difference between those two. Let's just do that. So we need some vector math again. We do subtract a vector, which is we subtract the new position from the old position. This is the new position. Okay? New position from old position gives us the vector that we actually moved our particle in our calculation. And this is our velocity now. So we plug this in here. And you can already see when I plugged that in, we got the vector input here. So this is piping back out here. And we can call it velocity. Let's just hit N, or we could call it V. But we're still not animating anything. So let's think about this. We have the velocity vector, and on the next frame, we're going to use that velocity to move our particle even further so that they're flying off of the sphere. Well, on the next frame here, let me just get this out of the way a little bit. That velocity coming back in here, we need a set position node, set position, and we're gonna move our particles using this velocity vector as an offset. And this is the input geometry that we're working with. How can I place this so that it makes sense? All right, I think this should be working now. Let's see. Oh, let me also save. Okay, so if I hit spacebar, nothing's happening. Why not? So let's see. We're gonna take the old. We have to take the new position and we have to subtract the old position. That's not this. This is the old position. So we go back to frame 1, hit spacebar, and yes, it's working. So the particles that used to be inside of the sphere, which are at the beginning at frame 0, are inside of the sphere. On frame 1, they're already moved out to the outside of the sphere. And then they have, because of that movement, they have a velocity, and we use that velocity to keep moving them outwards. So if I hit spacebar, you can see they're all moving. But there's already one thing we can see. They keep moving in the same speed. So this velocity vector that we get here, we also want to do something with that. We want to scale it to make them slow down over time. So scale that vector by something like 0.95. Gives us a new velocity vector. Let's see what that looks like. Shift cursor left, by the way, is go to frame 1 and then spacebar to play. And yes, it's working. They're all slowing down. So our first simulation inside of our simulation area between the input and the output is already pretty cool. Now these 3 nodes, we group those together into a separate node group, and we call that, I don't know, slow down. Slow down. You can put other information into this node later, but basically this is really the calculation that we do, our simulation. We plug in here, and then these nodes are just there to actually make an animation and use the information from the previous frame in the next frame. Now, next thing we have to do is calculate collisions between our particles. So how big is a particle? Right now, we're looking at a point cloud. So there's no real physical geometry in our scene yet. So if I hit render now, we wouldn't even see anything except for that big icosphere. Let's fix that first. We have to instance on points some geometry. Let's do another icosphere and a radius. Okay, we have to think about the radius. How about up here where we have our circle and then we have the points on that circle? How about we assign a set radius? There should be a set point radius. Perfect. And what radius do we want? We take one from the input of our modifier. Cool, so now each point has a radius and we can use that. Back here, we can just plug in the radius. We could take the group input, yep, radius. Okay, so now we have icospheres. Let's crank up the subdivisions and also, how do I align this? Smooth, let's look for smooth, set shade smooth. Let's make smooth icospheres. Yep, very nice. Okay, so now we have real geometry that we can actually look at. Now our radius is a bit big, so let's take it down to 0.2. Now, next thing, we're gonna plug in here the collision between the icospheres. Because you can already see we have some collisions here. Just the initial placement of the points, which is random, already has collisions. So we're gonna do the same thing again back here. We're gonna need a set position node, right? Set position in here, bring it down here, and now let's think about what we actually have to do. So we have to figure out which particle is colliding with another particle. And there is a node in geometry nodes, which is the index of nearest. Okay. Now you might not be thinking of index of nearest when you think about collisions, but hold on a second, because there's another node, which is the evaluate at index node. So they basically would go together like this. What does the index of nearest do? Well, you plug in the position and it gives you the index of another point in your point cloud, because that's the geometry that we're working with. This geometry is a point cloud. The index of the nearest, based on the position, point, and we evaluate on that object, that point, something, namely the position. So this setup, this is a very common thing. You need these 3 points. And what we get here, but this has to be vector, of course. So position of the point, right. So here we get the position of another point in our point cloud. And which one? The one that is nearest to our position. So for each point, this little setup, so let's look at this one maybe. For this point, bright pink so we can see them. Right, so this point inside of our calculation is going to look for the index of the nearest point based on the position, which is probably this one. And then we get the position of that point. Now, same thing again, what we've already done. We go vector math, subtract this point from our position, which gives us a vector between those 2 points, right? Vector. And if that length of the vector, so again, length of this vector, compare if the length is less than the radius of our particles. then we have a collision. Or is it twice the radius? Let me think. Yeah, 2 times the radius. So let's plug in the radius of a point and a math node. Just math multiply by 2. Those are the points that we have to move. So this is again the selection for our set position node. And where are we moving to? Same thing as before. This is our vector. Although I think I plugged this in the wrong way around. This has to be down here and this on the top. And then this would be the vector that we're moving. So we plug it into the offset, but we are going to scale this vector so that we only have really tiny movement in the offset. Because in the animation, we're just moving a little bit, and then over time, over all of our animation frames, it's gonna move in that direction. So they should be repelling each other now. Let's see if it works. Go back to frame 1, save, and spacebar. They're all moving now. Hold on. This is this vector, of course. So shift space. Yep. Cool. Let's go back to frame 1. Let's look at these here. So they're all colliding and they should be repelling and then they're all bouncing off each other. Yep. Perfect. All right. Now let's set the end to 1000 frames here so we can play with this a little. Bring this down. Hit spacebar and then move this around. Is this doing anything? Why isn't this doing anything? Yep, it's doing something. Cool. Go back to frame 1. All right, now we already have 2 simulations happening. Let's take all of these, Control-G, put them in a node group. Let's see, this is the input. And then what we're doing is we're setting a position based on an offset that we calculate based on index of nearest. And when we go out of this node group, this is now the particles collision. Let's just call it particle collision. Cool. We already have 2 simulations happening inside of our simulation area. Perfect. My name is Chris and I make free Blender tutorials here on YouTube. If you like the content, consider subscribing. Check out my Patreon page where you can download a whole lot of blend files of other tutorials, which you can of course also find for free here right on YouTube and also on Rumble. Big thanks to all my subscribers and patrons. Now let's get back to the tutorial. Now let's think about this real quick. For each frame, each particle looks for its nearest neighbor, and if that is too close, or basically inside, then we move that particle away from that neighbor, right? But we're doing, and we move it to a new position with that offset that we just did, but we're only doing this once for each particle. So if that particle that we're moving is now colliding with another particle on that first frame, we're not even touching it anymore. We've moved it and it's done, right? This particle collision setup that we have here is being executed once per frame per particle. But if we want something that in physics simulations would be called subframes or substeps, how can we do that? We only have one execution of our node tree per frame. Well, actually, that's pretty easy. What if the particle that we move then does another one of these calculations based on that position? Like if it's colliding with another particle, maybe we have to move again somewhere else. And the way we do that is simply by duplicating this node group. And now we have 2 subframes, right? So each particle does its own particle collision calculation twice per frame. And if we do it again, we now have 3 subframes. and 4 subframes, and so on and so forth. You get the idea. So what we can do here is, let's do 10. Cool, so now we have 10 subframe calculations. Let's see if it works. Spacebar, and we get very detailed movement on each frame. So this is probably hard to see right now. Hold on. But you can see that they're colliding very, very nicely. Compared to just one, let's see if we can see a difference. Go back to frame 1. I don't know if you can see this. You have to look very closely. But if I go back to frame 1, hit spacebar and then move this, you can see I can push the particles to be inside of each other, and then only over time they actually detach. I don't know how to explain this, but maybe you can see it. I can push them and they're inside of each other. But with our subframes, if I plug this back in here, go back to frame 1, spacebar, move this, you can see it. I cannot push them into each other. They're on each frame, we're calculating 10 subframes, 10 subcalculations, so that whenever we're moving the particle and in that position it will collide with another particle, we do more calculations, like 10 times. Okay? So now, of course, this would be much nicer if there was like a loop or something in Geometry Nodes, but I think for now we have to live with this. We can, however, make this look nicer by taking all of these, Control G again, to put this all into its own node group. So we have 10 times our node group inside of this node group. And this again is the particle collisions. Of course, now this got all moved around here. Let's bring that back. So now inside of this node, we have 10 subframe calculations. Now we have almost everything done. Let's move this, spacebar, and then move it. Okay, so this works beautifully. Awesome. However, now we're shooting particles everywhere. We do not have them contained inside of this circle. So, you guessed it, we're gonna put in a third simulation calculation part of our simulation in here to make them stay inside of that circle. So maybe let's make some space back here. And then in here again, we are going to use a set position node, because we're gonna set the position of our particle. And we have to make sure that they stay inside of this circle. How do we do that? The circle we know has a radius of 1. So anything that is further away from the center of our world, further away than 1, has to be bounced back in. Okay, let's do this. We need the position of the particle, and we need to figure out if that position has a length greater than 1, because that's the radius of our circle. That's easy. Vector math. The position, right? The position of this particle is this vector. So, and if that's longer than 1, then it's outside. So if the length of my position vector is compare a vector, float vector greater than 1, which is the radius, then we have to do something. So this again is our selection. So if this particle moves out here, we're gonna push it back in. And the thing that I did for my demo video was I actually move it inwards quite a bit, which means it has a high velocity shooting back into our simulation. So no particle will ever be outside here. And if one makes it out there, we just shoot it back inside. How do we do that? we need the position. We need a new position, right? Okay, so we have a particle that made it out here. That is its position vector. And we want to move it down here. That seems to be pretty easy. We just need to take that position, shift a vector, math. We multiply that vector by something like 0.9. You know, take 10% off, put it back in here. And this is the new position. Let's see if that works. Let's delete this. Go back to frame 1. Save spacebar. Oh, wow. Yes, but it's very fast. So 0.9 is a bit much. 0.97. All right, so let's look at this. If a particle moves outside, it gets bounced back in like at high velocity. The advantage of this is that when we move this around, there's always something moving, because some particle will always be outside of that, especially if we go back here and put more particles into our scene. So at the beginning, we already have a whole bunch of particles colliding, which gives them their initial random velocity. And then when they're bouncing off the sides, they get pushed back in. This is actually a bit much. 500. Let's see. Yep. Cool. And it keeps moving, and it keeps moving. And if I move my sphere, I can bounce particles all around. Awesome. And we did all that from scratch using simulation nodes in Geometry Nodes. So now let's clean this up. This is the third part. Put it into a group. Organize this a little bit. Go back out. Put that in here. And this is, what shall we call it? Let's just call it circle bounds. Okay. And this is not just keeping it in, it's also like animating it back inwards. And then we have this cool thing. Now there's one thing left, and that is actually putting materials on this to make it look good. So if we go over here, this is kind of boring. Do we even have a camera in our scene? Yes, we do. So select the camera, Alt-G-R, which brings it back pointing down, then G-X brings it up. Let's get another 3D view in here. Look through the camera by numpad 0. This is what we're looking at. Let's do 1080 by 1080. Bring the camera up so that it's all in here. Here we can switch off the overlays and switch over to rendered view. And then it looks like this. Right, we have a world strength of 1. Let's make it black. Now let's think about our icosphere. Give it a new material, something cool looking. Metallic. We also need a light here. We have a sun lamp. Sun is good. Oh no, it's a point. Let's make it a sun lamp. Rotate. So give it some nice looking shadow over here. This is a bit bright. Cool, cool. And then probably add another light, a point light, move it up here to get another little reflection on here. 10 watts, yeah, that's good. Let's go back to the material. Let's make it pink, why not? Okay, now the particle material we have to actually set in here. Right, so we have instance on points, and then we do a shift A, where we can actually shift A. There's a material here, set material. We're gonna call this particle on the cube. Yep, okay. We use particle, set material, and then we can go to shading. Let's look at this. Let's look at it from the top. Switch off overlays, go to rendered view, and now we can play with the particle material. What do we want? Probably also metallic. Bring down the roughness. So we just have some highlights from our sun lamp. Awesome. And then also we want some color in here. And a real cool thing would be to have a color ramp that goes from dark blue. What? This is dark red. Dark blue to, now we can make it, I don't know, green. Then add another node in here and make this one like that. Set this to ease so we have a nice gradient. Maybe bring this up like that and plug that in here. And what I'm thinking about here is that I'm going to plug in a factor to use the velocity. And if it's standing still, the particle, it should be dark blue. And if it's moving fast, it should be this bright green or whatever color you want. So how do we do that? We have to bring this particle velocity information outside of geometry nodes. We can do that by simply taking this velocity output of our simulation output. So on each frame, each particle has a velocity. We plug that into our group output, which makes it available out here. I'm just going to call it V again. So now in shading, I can go attribute. We know we have instances, so we have to take the attribute from the instancer called V. And that should work. However, that velocity probably is very, it's also not a color, it's a factor. The velocity is probably very small, so we need a math node and multiply our velocity by something like 100. Does that change anything? Not yet. Oh, the velocity is a vector. Hold on. We need to do vector converter, vector math. Where is it? We have to do length of this velocity vector gives us the value. Is this doing anything? 200. Let's simulate this a little bit. So they should definitely have the value in there. Still not working. Hold on. Group output. Let's see. What do we have for an output here? Node. The group node output is a vector, subtype none, to attribute point. Ah, we have to set this to instance. Okay. Alrighty. Let's go back to shading. Let's see what we have. Yep, multiply by 100, 150. So we get a little bit more greenish. Yep, that's it. Now, of course, you could also go and plug this into the emission. What does that look like? So we don't have metallic, we just have emission. And if we switch on bloom and turn up the emission strength, then we get some nice bloom effect going. Cool. 120 maybe. All right, now let's go back to geometry nodes. So this is what we have. And of course, now we can play with the density here. We could, for example, set the density to something higher. Go back to frame 1. And then go to our modifier and turn down the radius of each particle. What does that look like? Looks very cool. So this is real time. I mean, this is pretty amazing, huh? I can move this and we get this awesome looking thing in real time. And now it is time for you to play with all the variables and settings in the geometry nodes node tree, and of course the materials, and render out something really cool looking. And if you do, please tag me because I want to see it too. The finished blend file of this tutorial is available at patreon.com/chrisp. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Thank you so much. And thanks for watching. See you soon.